Hi everybody, it's GM Amy here. The video I'm just about to show you is an extract of the game between Hakaru Nakamura and Levon-Aronian, played in the 2015 Sinquefield Cup. This was the very first game in the first round, which is a lucky punch by Nakamura. It's actually referred to as Hakaru's lucky punch at Levon-Aronian in St. Louis, Missouri. This was the game played the day before Hakaru Nakamura took on the mighty Magnus Carlsen in what seemed to be an epic game. But before I get started with that game, I kindly request you to help me by subscribing to this channel, or better still, hit the like button of this video, as all proceeds and donations will go out to support the kids in their hoods through learning chase. Thanks, and that's my humble appreciation for you. Well, back in 2015, Hakaru Nakamura took on Levon-Aronian in the very first round in a game that seemed to be all drawish. And the day after, he took on the mighty Carlsen in a two-match game where Levon was watching from the side. Hakaru Nakamura decided to wear sunglasses for his games with Magnus Carlsen. He drew the first game and lost in the second game. A bit disappointed with the results, but that could have come just because all his luck through the tournament had evened out through this game. So this position arose just after 30 moves, after knight times c5 was played by Hakaru, and Hakaru was with the white pieces, whereas Levon had the black pieces. Knight times c5, Levon's queen is under attack. So this is when Levon played a very grievous mistake. It's more than an inaccuracy, whether it was due to lack of concentration, but this really cost Levon dearly. A very simple queen to c6 would have had the game, in a drawish position, and perhaps the game would continue on with a knight back to e4. Then you push f5, he pushes c4, maybe rook, an exchange of rooks, a couple of rooks would go off the board, rook times d1, rook times d1, push to f4, and perhaps queen to b2. Now this queen to b2 move is a bait. It does not signify that this pawn can be picked. This pawn is immune. You cannot have this queen picking this pawn, because as soon as you pick the c4 pawn, you lose an exchange immediately. Just to show you, if that happened, then knight would check on f6, and king has to move to h8. That way you can even do a little bit of a zorn, see a discover, get back. Now queen g7 would be a very grievous mistake, as this leads to a discover, double attack, and mate. It becomes mate in one. You don't want to have the king moving on g7, because if there is a discover attack to knight e8 or knight f4, the queen then comes and mates right here. So you don't want to be moving the king to g7. Best would be have the king move to h8. That would be the rightful move, and the king can only move between these squares back and forth. Just to show you that here, in a slight move of the king to f8, you either move here on g8 or here, because it's a double queen, and this is met instantly. So you don't want to go that route. What you have to do is get back and have the king move to h8. That's the only move, and then that way you would have a discover attack on the rook, which ideally you can now move here because that's a check. You will have to move to king g8 and have this picked up. Yep. But you don't want to be falling into this. Then the game would continue with queen check, king h1, then queen recaptures, queen captures on f8. Picks that knight with the queen, but at this point, it's a 3.5 not point lead, so it's almost lost. You don't want to go this route. So back to the game. Levon, out of lack of concentration, seems to have played a game, and he played queen b5. Now this queen b5 move is very suspicious. It calls for an exchange, but a very big mistake. At this point, Hakaru saw this and took an opportunity where he says if you let such opportunities slip through you, then it's really very hard to perform well in a tournament. So he grabbed this with both hands and exchanged. So it's queen times b5, a times b5, and now here he loses an exchange. He plays knight d7, and that has a trapped rook. This rook basically here is trapped. It don't matter whether you play rook e8, knight will simply have to check you at f6, and you'll have an exchange being lost. So at this time, Levon realized his mistake and he had to just capture the knight at d7 with his rook. So Levon captures, and at this point, it's a 3.8 point lead. That's when Levon realized that things had gone wrong. So knight times, rook times d7, Hakaru recaptures on d7 with his rook, and then the swinging of the rook started. So he plays rook a8, perhaps try and activate his rook, but then Hakaru plays king f2 to centralize the king or even make it as an active king. a6 is such a good move because what it does, it's looking at having the rook swing to defend this square when need arises, and at the same time you will also be able to defend this pawn from the back. Here, so at this point Hakaru goes to assault the knight on f5 by g4. Very typical of Hakaru. Those are Hakaru moves. Knight h4, and then he continues with f4. Now this is a lot of action on the king side, whereas black, Levon, has not managed to make any activity on his king side. He then plays rook c6 to attack the pawn on c3. Hakaru is not about to defend such pawns, because when you have rooks on board and you're in an endgame, always look out for active rooks and rather than defending. So he then checks on e8. That move, what it does, it buys him time, so that when you have the king getting out of the way, out of the check to the 7th line, you allow the rooks piled onto this line and looking at this pawn immediately, and that's exactly what really happens. So Levon plays king to g7 and then rook on e to e7 to just pin up that rook. At this point, Levon realized and he had to defend this pawn. This is a very weak pawn and you don't want to open up the 7th rank. So he did defend that using his rook, and he played rook f6. Now, what rook f6 does as well, it attacks the f pawn, the f4 pawn, and the best way to come out of this is to try and bring in the king to defend the pawn, well as well as uh, well as attacking the knight on h4, and that's exactly what Hakaru does. King g3. Now king g3 has to have the knight on h4 defended, and he had to play g5. Now Hakaru is not about to exchange out pawns right now. Because if he does to exchange this, that would have a rook. This is a bit of a rook check down here, so he left the position closed by pushing f5. Levon tries to open up the position by having him push h4, so that just in case he picks here, then the knight can easily pick up this pawn in check. The knight would pick up this in check and perhaps fork the rook and the king. Hakaru wasn't about to take such baits, and ideally what he did at this point was he played a very cunning move, and this could have been the moment of the game that Levon realized it was all over for him. He played rook e6, and at this point Levon resigned. That was the last nail in the coffin. But perhaps the game would have continued like this. H times g4, rook times f6, and then the king captures on f6. King captures this on g4, and then knight captures on f5. But this is where the fire came in. So during the analysis, Hakaru agreed that he would pick or capture at f7, just so he could be able to take out this knight. This is a no-sense knight. So capturing on f7 skews the king away from the knight so that the knight can be picked on the other pawn, which would lead to an automatic loss. So that's what Hakaru does best when it comes to endgames, and absolutely he would pick that. That's in check. It's a must pick. King captures f5. King perhaps back to g8, then the pawn on g5 falls. At this point it's really all over. The h pawn cruises home. This is a very unstoppable pawn. It will go cruise, or you will even just leave it and have the king come this side, come all the way to here to match this pawn, and once this is out, it's all over. So that was the game, and if just to demonstrate for you how that would be done, you just have to play that way, yeah, and once that is taken, it's game down. What a lucky punch that was for Hakaru. He managed to play really well. However, Magnus Carlsen crowned top of the Sinquefield Cup 2015. As it was expected, Hakaru came second as his biggest challenger. It was such a good tournament. Again, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for the next game. I hope to show the games between Magnus Carlsen and Hakaru Nakamura next. Very interesting games they were. Or hit the like button, just so you can be able to support the kids in the hood. Thanks. See you in the next video.